Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming. Please, if you get a chance to talk to Steve later, don't tell him that I would have hosted the panel, even if it wasn't at a brewery. I think we've got a great subject, and I think we have a great panel of guests, so I appreciate you all coming out tonight. And thanks again to Arcadia Ales for hosting us. I'd like to introduce the panel that we have this evening. Starting at my far right, Dr. Michael Rice is the superintendent of the Kalamazoo Public Schools. Dr. Rice has been superintendent here since August 2007. Before that, he was the superintendent in the Clifton Public Schools District in New Jersey. And the State Association of School Administrators honored Dr. Rice with the Michigan Superintendent of the Year award last year. Matinga Ragatz, to my left, was a classroom teacher for 22 years. She taught social studies and world languages at Grand Ledge High School, and before that at Lansing Christian. She was Michigan Teacher of the Year in 2011, was elected to the National Teachers Hall of Fame this year, and is now an instructional innovation consultant working to help teachers innovate in the classroom and to incorporate new technologies into their teaching. Directly to my right is Dan Quisenberry. He's the president of the Michigan Association of Public School Academies. The group represents more than 90% of Michigan's charter schools. Dan has worked in the areas of governmental affairs and policy development, also in business, previously with the State Chamber of Michigan, and he's been with the Michigan Association of Public School Academies since 1997. And at my the far left, Dr. Gary Miron. Miron is a professor of educational leadership, research, and technology at Western Michigan University. His research focuses on private education management organizations and efforts to make systemic change in urban and rural schools. He often leads evaluations and studies of schools, many of which have been funded by grants and contracts from state and federal agencies. And he also once helped open a private cooperative school in Sweden. Please welcome all our guests. So tonight's conversation is about the future of public education, and some of that is where we stand now and where we're going here in Michigan. And the Department of Education for the state set a goal of being a top 10 state in education in 10 years. That goal was announced about 2 years ago, late 2015. And I think it's fair to say that we're in any of the major categories, we are not near the top 10 in Michigan currently. And here's just a sampling to give us a baseline. In grade 4 math, current rankings, and these are from the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which puts out the nation's report card regularly and has for decades. Grade 4 math, 43rd. Reading, 42nd. Science, 42nd. 8th grade math, 26th. That's a tie. Reading, 32nd. Science, tied for 26th. We're in Kalamazoo, so I'd like to give the first question to Dr. Rice, since we're on his home turf here. Have you seen any effects yet of that plan for top 10 rankings, that goal? And how do you think we get there in the long range? I know that's sort of a broad question.
Right. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. I appreciate that. I would say that, top 10 in 10 by definition is 10 years, and we're 1 year into it. That's a skinny 1 year. That's the first thing. The second thing is that if we're going to get to the top 10 in the next 9 years, we're going to have to get a lot more serious about literacy early, and particularly literacy for our working class and poor children, and particularly our working class and poor children in urban areas. We're going to have to get more serious about funding of our children. A lot of ratios are going to have to improve. Our student-teacher ratios are going to have to improve. We're going to have to improve our student counselor ratios as well. Quite a bit is going to have to improve if we're going to make inroads into this. You're going to get what you pay for. And right now, given the challenge of our young people, the socioeconomic challenge and exposure exposure gap of our young people, we need to pour more into them on the front end to get more out of them in the back end.
Dr. Miron, your research has looked at school districts that are working to make systemic change, including some rural districts in Louisiana, urban districts here in Michigan. Some of these districts have their own systemic change to make, Detroit being one example. But you also, in this case, have the state saying we need to make widespread changes. What are the advantages and pitfalls of such a broad mandate like a top 10 in 10 type approach?
I think
Doesn't...
Testing, 1, 2.
Oh,
I think it's always important to set high objectives and try to pursue those. It's perhaps that's not quite realistic, especially given the direction Michigan is moving right now. It's projected that within 12 years we'll move from 41st on the NAEP assessment to 48. And so our numbers are going the wrong direction. I think it's really important, to set high targets, but I also think it's very important that we have intermediate targets so we can realistically move forward. Because right now it's going to be very ambitious, perhaps quite an unrealistic goal to move that far ahead.
Matinga, you were in the classroom for more than 20 years, and as we mentioned, teaching social studies and world languages. The state's plan calls for a couple of its sections call for ways to make teachers feel more sort of professionally rewarded and appreciated, also calls for more training and mentoring. What do you see as the role that could play, and how could that come to bear in the classroom?
It's a great question. I think that, teachers are excluded for the most part from the conversation. And I'm going to tell you what every teacher knows. And what every teacher knows is that a lot of the science of ranking is really not a science at all. And we know, for example, that third graders come in different sizes, ninth graders come in different heights, and their brains kind of match their growth. And we know that their date of manufacture is just a weird coding or category that we placed them 100 years ago. And so to rank our students by this really bizarre artificial measurement and work towards that goal, I can tell you, every teacher in the audience will tell you, that is just not a good way to measure whether or not our kids are prepared for their future. We have to continue to remember, thank you, we have to continue to remember that the goal of schools, or the purpose of schools, is to prepare the students for a successful life and not to prepare them for these rankings and for these tests. And so if you are to put the teachers on the table to have a conversation about ranking, I think we will all agree that first we have to rank them about what the kids can do, not how well they test. And so once we understand this kid can do this and he's prepared for life, I think that's a great goal to have, to be top 10 in 10 of kids who just kick ass. Sorry, I didn't mean to put some spice in there, but that's my thing.
I don't think that's part of the state's formal plan, just to be clear. Dan, rankings mean different things to different organizations. From the charter school perspective, what is the view of trying to get a handle on what success looks like over the course of, say, a 10-year plan?
It's a great question, and I think the question, not just in Michigan, but across the country. I'll tell this little bit of a story, but it's going towards what you're asking, Doug. I was at a national event, and a similar kind of conversation came up, and similar kind of reaction to testing and the kinds of challenges we have with that. Well, let's ask a general question. What are we trying to do with public education? Okay, Dan, that's almost too stupid and obvious, right? We're trying to make sure all kids succeed. Every child should have access to a great education so they're prepared for their future, they become great citizens, et cetera, right? That's obvious. How do you measure that? What is it? What does kick-ass look like? It isn't the simple things we're using today. It is not orange or lime green or a top-to-bottom ranking. But we do need to answer the question, what data will we use to know that kids are actually getting that kind of success, that we're actually there, that we're making progress? I would relate it a little bit, Doug, too, and this is part of the question. I think that the state, I would say we're not even a year into the state plan. We haven't even finalized the plan yet. And part of it is still deciding what success is going to look like and how are we going to define that. And I don't think it's going to be perfect, but we need to do better than we're doing, and we need to decide on something that can be respected and embraced and will tell us a little bit. It's a little bit like the medical field. At least tell us what our blood pressure is. At least tell us some basic things that we can dig deeper on then and understand where our kids are at. Because right now we're using a lot of nonsense and nothing.
Do you agree with that, Dr. Rice?
I think the medical analogies only go so far. You look at certain things in the medical field, they're clearly out of bounds. People die. The same is less clear in education. What happens with a number of our kids in a number of our schools is that they're resource deprived. They're exposure deprived, and they're resource deprived. And you end up getting the unhappy consequence of years of lack of resource and lack of exposure. What I want for our kids are the best resources available in places like Grosse Pointe and Forest Hills and school districts across the state that are pouring into their kids in enormous ways, not simply during the 1,098 hours of school each year, but also outside of school, 3 to 6 p.m., weekends, holidays, summers as well. These kids are leading markedly richer lives in terms of exposure. Our children in Kalamazoo and in Detroit and Flint and Saginaw and Grand Rapids and Lansing and Jackson and Battle Creek deserve the same thing.
And Dan, you wanted to respond to that?
Just because I'm interested in exploring this a little bit. Dr. Rice, you said in your opening comments that we should focus on literacy, and I agree with you on the things about focusing our resources on kids. So a question that I was trying to lead to, what out of literacy could we look at that might be a good indicator that we're actually making some progress with that? If we're going to focus and double down on literacy, how do we know we're doing it?
Well, from an input perspective, we could have lower student-teacher ratios at the early grades. We could have reading coaches in every single elementary school. We could have librarians, certified librarians in each elementary school, rather than part-time library aides. So those are three things at the elementary level that I think that we could do on an input, from the input perspective. From the perspective of outputs, kids have to, there's a quantitative issue, there's a qualitative issue. Kids have to read and read regularly, read frequently, read across a broad range of genres. They have to be reading in the summer. There's extensive research that suggests that the gaps between middle-class students and working-class and poor children, on the other hand, is overwhelmingly a function not of what happens during the school day or the school year, but rather during the summer. And so we've got to get into the summer. Our kids have to have richer experiences in the summer. They can't have these yawning 2.5, 3-month gaps in the summer that are, for all intents and purposes, protections for the tourist industry in the state of Michigan.
I want to turn and stick a little bit with the idea of metrics and how we get to some of that quantitative data. Gary, when you're looking at a system and you're talking about testing and getting those metrics, what are there best practices that you've seen in the different systems that you worked with? Is simpler better? Is more testing worse than less testing? Are there any broad strokes that are guidance for getting the data that people in the school systems can use most effectively?
Well, we have our national rankings within our country. Then we have international rankings, and we can learn a lot from what high-performing countries are doing. And if we take a country like Finland, they have lots of testing and exams or assessments. They're not high-stakes exams, though, and they don't have to test every kid every year in every subject. They have more exams across more subjects, but they do it strategically as a way to get a dipstick test on how students are performing to guide policy. Not to guide the work of teachers, but to guide policy to see where there's investments are needed and so forth. So we see countries using assessments in a constructive way and not focused on the high-stakes assessments that we have here. When we look at the data in terms of how much time America, our teachers, spend with test administration and test prep, we're the number one in the world in terms of testing and test prep. but I don't think that's necessary. It's taking away a lot of time from instruction.
Does that high level of testing in Finland come at the expense of some of the other categories that we see people say are hurt here in the U.S., like the arts or things that are maybe not a priority for our testing?
They don't spend they have more. If they have the number of tests is larger because they test across many more subjects, but they don't test all the kids every year and so it's strategically done. So they don't spend as much time testing as we do. They do it strategically, and teachers are still doing their own in-class authentic assessments of their students and making sure that they make progress towards the national standards that guide the work. And most of the high-performing countries, they have national standards that guide the work of schools and educators. But the assessments that they administer are formative in nature. They're not the high-stakes assessment that we stress about in our country.
Matinga, Dr. Nikolai Viti in the Detroit School District recently announced that one of his first acts was an attempt to cut testing. They were giving, I think, 186 tests total across the district, and they're reducing that to 57, which in some scenarios still sounds like a big number. So what is it like to be on the other end of that when you're in the classroom, and where is that balance? Obviously, some metrics are needed, but how does that affect the day-to-day for teachers?
It's disruptive at the least, but more importantly, and I want to pick up on what Gary said, teachers, we go to the same colleges you do, and we get the same degrees you do, but then we get into the classroom and we're given a program that we have to follow, a script that we have to follow, as if we hadn't spent our 4 or 8 years becoming master teachers. And one of the things that is happening right now is that there are so many programs and so many scripts for literacy or for mathematics that teachers, we are losing our autonomy to freestyle in the classrooms, which is what they're doing in the more successful school districts. We cannot just apply our art. We cannot apply our passions. We have to follow a script. One of the more heartbreaking things that I experience every day is I have my 9th grader coming, he comes home, and I ask him the question, what question it is. So how was school today? It was school, Mom. And to me, I just find it heartbreaking. This school is going to have my child for 4 years, and for 4 years, my child is going to come home saying, it's heartbreaking. But we are so much interested in the tests and the metrics and the measurements that we're forgetting to measure the fact that children are not engaged, teachers are burning out because they cannot teach, and we are failing the system not because we don't have the resources or not because we don't have the talent, but because we constantly apply these metrics and all of this data, and a lot of the teachers spend most of the time doing data and worrying about policy than worrying about influencing and guiding children to become great human beings. Thanks.
Dan, I want to turn back to you, and you were talking about earlier that you think it's important that the state sets a plan and you have to drive towards something. But I think one of the concerns that I've heard in talking to people, in my own circle of friends and family is the number of changes, too, that there's been changes in state testing, and then you get a different administration at the federal level or a different administration at the state level. Do you have concerns that at some point maybe sticking with something and then making adjustments within that has a chance to be less disruptive, if you know what I mean?
If I'm understanding that question, I would agree, yes. Having a plan means you have a plan and you stick to it. And it's coherent. My friend Ray is out there, a good coherent plan. Something that's respected and consistent and respected by educators. When you look at other states, and again, I want to point out 2 things here. One, we're talking a lot about things, and yet we're all assuming that you can measure countries, you can measure other states, you can measure things, and yet we kind of deny that we're willing to have measures. I just want to keep that out there. We need to figure that out. But second, to go back to the point, successful states, ones we're looking at and saying, they're doing something right there, have put those plans in place, and it has to do with figuring out this standard or success and the assessment strategies and everything that goes with that. and then staying with it. And yet you look behind the curtain, it's also something that people kind of go, I'm not real excited about this, but I respect it. I know what it is. I know how to impact it. I know what to do. It doesn't disrupt my classroom. It actually aids me because I'm getting the data that I need to do what I need as a professional. We got to figure that out. And I will charge a little bit because I'm one of the guys that works in Lansing. I think Lansing's our problem. And I'm not saying our elected officials. It's the people that advise them. None of them are experts in this. There's an intentional, sometimes politics around just disrupting the system so we don't end up with something because I just don't think there's always a lot of popularity around having a plan, sticking to it, and being accountable. But those words are loaded, and I know what I mean by them, but a lot of people take different things by them. But we got to get to success.
But Matinga, I think what I hear you saying earlier is that you said teachers are the last to know. Is that trickle down not happening in your experience?
Absolutely not. And not only is it not happening, but it's misinformation. So it's like playing telephone. By the time that we hear it in the classroom, the message has been garbled. Or worse, by the time our message gets to Lansing, it's garbled 50 times over. But to come back to the testing, again, to really think about the reason for the testing. So if the reason for the testing is, like you said, you get the dipstick and you kind of get a measurement so that it can inform our direction, there's a test that teachers are trained to do in the classroom. And what's really neat about what happens in the classroom is that it's customized. I am testing the students in my cultural surround, in my community, about what's happening in my classroom, rather than this really bizarre test that comes from alien ships and just kind of lands. And that's the one that's going to decide my job the next year. And so my biggest problem with this metrics and the rankings is that it's not only misinformation, but it's also used very irresponsibly. It's used for ranking. Where education, teaching is messy and it's not measurable. You cannot use the same way. You cannot teach the same way to the year after year after year. It's kind of like using the same fashions. Imagine if you go to your favorite fashion shop and they have the fashions from 2 years ago and they're selling you stale fashions at the same price. And this is what we do with students when we constantly put these standards that, every third grader has to do it every year. Well, the third graders this year are different from the ones from last year. And the kids are like, and the teachers end up going, the kids today, the kids from this class, they're terrible. No, it's like you're selling them stale stuff. That's why they're terrible. So the tests have to be not only a temperature of what's happening in the classroom, but just a reality check, because I feel like at this point we're playing with people's lives. We're playing with kids' lives in a very lazy way. Let's just give them a test that we'll give them every 3 years to everybody in the nation and see what happens with that. So let's use the test responsibly, compassionately, and also in a way that really informs our practice.
I want to turn from some of the metrics and the data and testing to school choice, and I'd like to turn back to you, Dr. Rice. A recent MSU study showed that school choice did not have a significant effect on academics, and obviously some families make choices about school choice that are unrelated to academics. They may be for better environment or logistics. I want to get your perspective from a large district in the state here. How has school choice affected what you're doing, and what's your view of it?
Well, we're supportive of school choice in Kalamazoo. We have a number of magnet schools within the district. We bus to magnet schools throughout the district. We have 17 elementary schools. They offer different experiences for children. We have 5 middle schools. They offer different experiences for children. 4 high schools. They offer different experiences for children. We're supportive of choice, not only within district choice, but cross-district choice as well. Unfortunately, however, we've bought into this feeling among some, present company accepted, of course, that choice might be a panacea, and it's not a panacea. It's one of many different things that should be about the improvement of public education. I think that there's a tremendous benefit to having a dual language school in Kalamazoo, which we set up El Sol Elementary in 2008, or a Montessori school, one of the few publicly accredited Montessori programs in the country, which we set up a few years prior to that. We have an environmental science academy. We have a number of different experiences for young people. I buy that. What I don't buy is putting all my money, all my hopes, all my dreams, all my expectations for driving school reform on choice. I don't think too many reformers would do that. Again, including the people with us today.
Does managing that palette of options, though, become even more difficult for you and your staff?
Absolutely.
You have so many things with so many focuses?
There's no question. There is no question that it is awkward to try to manage certain choice opportunities or certain opportunities of choice within a public school environment, particularly with high-stakes testing. So, you talk about this whole notion of really kind of unleashing creativity and really engaging kids in an extraordinary way. Montessori education is phenomenal in that regard. But Montessori education in a high-stakes public school testing environment is very, very challenging to work together. A dual language school is outstanding. I believe strongly. I am a former world language teacher. And yet to teach children two languages in a high-stakes testing environment, particularly in an urban public school environment, is a trick. It's harder. Now, minus the high stakes, it's something that can be done in a much easier fashion. What are the tremendous benefits of kids learning two languages before they're 9, 10, 11 years old? They're enormous. But they are in some ways, they run counter in some ways, a high-stakes testing environment in 1,098 skinny hours in a school year.
Dan, choice is part of the charter school ethos. I mean, options and having charters that outline specific areas of interest for parents and students. How do you see the schools that you deal with dealing with that complexity that Dr. Rice was just talking about? You've got different focus from school to school, and you also have to meet the demands of the state, but at the same time, you're trying to live up to what you've been assigned to do or what you've set out to do.
Did you say parents or educators?
The educators, yeah.
Let me answer both if I can. First, I would agree with Dr. Rice here, too. Choice alone is not a panacea. Charter schools sometimes are held up as, wow, that choice, the only choice. We actually have a multitude of choices at Michigan, the largest being inter-district choice, with over 200,000 some parents, maybe 20% of our population. You got another 150,000 that have chosen charter schools. It continues to be very popular with parents and families and communities. Educators, I would say, let me go back to finish that point. So at least three pillars, I think, are part of the solution. And we actually tried to do this through Proposal A back 25 years ago. Choice, changing funding so it follows children, and I would say even weighting it towards poverty and making sure we have resources for kids that demand and need more resources, and then the standard of accountability. We've done one out of those three in Michigan, and I would say that's part of the reason we haven't succeeded as well as we should. Let me go back to your question, Doug. How do educators deal with that? I think it makes it more possible. Let me use an example. There are different kinds of choices because kids are different, very different, right? I had two daughters, same household, same situation, completely different in how they learned, what they wanted to learn, how they went about that. And that, if that's true in my house, think about what it is in the state of Michigan. So you go to a place like Dearborn, Michigan, the largest population of Middle Eastern people outside of the Middle East. How does Dearborn Public address that? They couldn't very well. So you open charter schools that can meet the needs of that language, that culture, those specific things, and it becomes a system, ideally, where it's working for the community and the people in it, and they've got a variety of quality choices. All should be excellent, all should be held to some standards, and all should have resources available to them.
What is your view of the competition that creates and that district school choice creates? For example, just recently, a Detroit parent told the Free Press that she had been contacted by 4 districts other than her own district about having her child come to their schools, and schools want students. They want that resource. They want the funding that comes along with that. Are the charter schools and school choice creating competition that's making it less about we're getting to the right goal and instead just sort of fighting for slices of the pie.
That's going to be true no matter what. If you go back, any of us that are old enough to remember, Kalkaska was pre-choice and struggled with fighting for the resources and population changes, et cetera. So some of that's going to be undeniable no matter what. Again, I'm thinking about ideals. There are the opposite of ideals that we've got to talk about a little bit about too. What do you do when schools don't perform well, when they need to change, when failure has gone beyond bad and it's actually really wrong? What do we do? We haven't dealt with that in Michigan either. But to your point, good schools, we tell this to our charter school folks, if you can't differentiate yourself so that people just know, hey, yeah, I know what that is, I want it. It's not about going out and offering computers and flyers and a pizza party. That just doesn't get it. Some people will do it. They don't have that down. So the ideal is you've got a purpose for why you exist, and people understand it, and you can make your system work that way. And it's different enough that Dr. Rice and the Kalamazoo Public Schools can succeed, and the other schools can succeed. Some may fail in there, but they probably should, because they're not serving the public well. They're not serving the community well. Adults should fail, not kids.
I should note while we're talking about school choice that we did invite U.S. Secretary of Education Betsy Ross to join us tonight, and she had other obligations in Washington. Dr. Miron, what does the research show about school choice programs? Is that something that's unique to the U.S.? Is that something that's practiced elsewhere? And how does it fare?
So, first of all, when we're thinking about school choice, we often, and many of our policymakers today, think about school choice as an end in itself, instead of looking at school choice as a tool, as a policy tool. School choice can be designed to reduce segregation through magnet programs that are quota-based. It can be used to promote innovation and research and development and share those ideas. It can be designed for many things. But as practiced in our state, in particular with some of the more private-oriented school choice programs like charter schools, we're seeing acceleration of segregation by race, by social class. We're seeing segregation by ability. We're seeing segregation especially by special education status, with children with moderate and severe disabilities concentrated in the district schools. We're seeing it segregation increase by language of instruction. So it's a tool that can be divisive as well. But it's not an end in itself. We have to look at it as a policy tool. And when we look at what other countries are doing, what we typically see is some countries are way beyond the United States in terms of school choice. But there tends to be more regulation of those choices, again, with national standards, and then leaving it up to schools and teachers to implement that. But they often have centralized standards driving the education system, but regulation over those choice forms. Also more regulation over the selection process, where we see increasingly schools choosing children rather than families choosing schools. And that's how they structure entry processes and exit processes, especially with repeated suspensions and other activities that convince and coerce some students to go back to the traditional public schools. So in our state, we've seen acceleration of segregation across many dimensions, and I think that's a concern that we have. Just want to talk about one other thing about choice. Michigan is unique because we've been seeing a ticking down of our population. Kalamazoo, Michael Rice, you're very fortunate. We've got the Kalamazoo Promise. Our schools are full. But what we're seeing with school choice in many of our urban districts is the population is going down slowly. And with choice, we're seeing schools, charter schools and district schools competing for limited resources. And the traditional public schools are fixed. They have a lot of fixed cost associated with their systems, and it's very difficult for them to be viable as they lose their numbers. When we contrast that with the Carolinas or Florida, they also have competitive charter school programs and so forth. They don't have the same negative effect that we're seeing in the Midwest because of our population shifts that are happening right now and the economies of scales in our districts.
So that's a function of the population in the Florida and the Carolinas being stable or growing?
Right. Correct.
Matinga, from the choice perspective for teachers, in some cases you have teachers who are in districts and maybe looking for their want to find a more challenging opportunity or find an opportunity that provides some more resources, but you have a situation where charter schools may not be covered by the same union or it may not be the same pay scale. Is it difficult for teachers who who feel stuck in their district and don't feel like they also have the opportunity to be sort of sought after when they know that they're one of the better educators?
For sure, and especially because in some circumstances, the rules change. So the rules are not the same in either in public schools or in the schools of choice. And one of the fallacies that I would like to bring up when it comes to parents choosing other schools or using.
It's not that we don't want to hear your point. We did not schedule the train to go by. So.
I just want to be in the. No, but
a few more cars.
No, the point that I was trying to say is that the American schools are not as bad as we make them to be, and I want to make sure everybody knows that. The teachers are doing their job, administrators are doing their job, and we're working very, very hard at raising your children and guiding them. So we are not and this is from a person, you can hear from my world accent that I've traveled the world, I've gone to schools in different countries, and I can tell you nobody does diversity like American schools. Nobody has the diversity burden like American schools. And so starting from the point that we are not, and what makes us bad is the testing scores, not what we do in the classroom. And knowing that is burdensome to teachers, whether it's a teacher in a public school and a school of choice, where you are being measured by a measuring stick that's broken. And thank you. And I don't care whether, as a teacher, I just want to hang out with kids. That's the best job in the world. Although I support public schools, because I come from a public school system, I want the best for every child. But I also want the best teaching environment for every teacher, because if you would just take away some of these weird obstacles that you've put for us, I think you wouldn't have to worry about the way that the schools are divided. We would do it ourselves. We're trained, we're specialists, and we know what we're doing.
In just a minute here, we're going to start taking some... we'll take some questions from the audience, and I'd like to start with a question that we received through our website over the past week. We had some of our listeners send in their questions through our Am I Curious project at michiganradio.org, and I'd like to direct this to Michael Rice. This question came from Nan, who's a listener in the Kalamazoo area, and she asked, what should education for high-potential children look like, and how would changes in this area improve education overall in the state of Michigan?
Well, I think, it looks different at different levels. But ideally, you would see the opportunity to fly substantially free in middle school and high school, to largely go at your own pace, to work in cooperative groups, to do independent research, to do writing associated with that independent research, to do writing commensurate with your given level at a given point in time, so that you may have young people who are really quite gifted in writing. They're writing longer. They're writing more involved. People who are less gifted in writing would be writing shorter pieces, less involved pieces. They should be writing in different genres. They should be reading in different things. They should be comparing text to text or book to book.
But maybe not to text messages.
No, text messages are out. I'm pro punctuation. I'm pro capital letters. Anti acronyms. Hard to understand. I have to ask my kid what exactly it is that's on my my screen. So I think there's a fair bit of independence in middle school and high school that you'd see. I think it would be an expansion of AP courses, but I don't think it would simply be AP courses. I think it would be dual enrollment courses. I think it would be exploratory courses. I think you'd have skinny courses, so you have immersion courses of 30 days or a month long where you dive into a particular subject and really immerse yourself in that subject. So that's what I'd like to see middle school and high school. At the elementary school level, I'd like to see every child master a world language. But you can't expect the mastery of another language in the context of 180 days, in the context of 1,098 hours. If we're really going to be serious about public education, we have to do public education more of the school year. It's just not possible to get it done right with 180 days and 1,098 school hours.
Anybody else want to chime in on that before we turn it over to audience
Sure,
questions?
I'd like to kind of add to that. And I believe like the question specifically talked about a high functioning student, and I believe that all students function in their level. And again, this idea, because we have separated them in artificial groups by age. Of course, I hope like when I'm elderly, I don't get put in a category where it's like, well, this elder, by 80, you should be able to parachute off of a plane like George Bush did. That's the category. So we're putting them in these weird categories. And so I feel like all children have their own genius, but these weird categories make some kids not be the same genius as others. So now this high-functioning student, I would love. For we're talking about how do you engage this child more than more school. The student needs more experiences. So you cannot be a writer without your experiences. And sometimes we are asking a 10-year-old to imagine climbing a mountain or driving in the river, and he doesn't have a river next to him. Why not just hose him down with water? Have him experience shivering and playing in the water. Let's experience goose pimples. And now we have something to talk about because we've done our field research, right? Rather than more school. Because more school for my ninth grader is a terrible idea. More school is not going to make him be a better learner. Instead, ease up on the track and give them more life experiences, more playtime, more genius hour, more things to do and think about, and they will do less texting.
I'm still stuck on the idea that when I'm 80, somebody will be saying, like, you're not playing gin rummy at an 80-year-old level, Doug. I'm sorry. Dan, you had something to add there.
I'm hanging on that, too. That was a great one. I think they just made a case for why choice is important in this whole environment. Kids are very different. A word we keep hearing from parents and the public and communities and neighborhoods is fit. Does this fit my kid? I think it's impossible that we expect single institutions to deliver all of that to a single community. So we can today offer a variety of different options. It's something, frankly, I haven't seen enough of in the charter sector. Too many times it's a replacement for failure and has been used as such, which I think is a misuse of it. We should be delivering innovative ways of saying, in this building, we're going to do this kind of thing, and here's people how to understand how to do it and do it very well, whether it's an aviation academy at the Gerald Ford Airport, which actually exists, or whether it's a cultural school like I gave you before in Dearborn, or whether it's a Montessori elementary school. These are different ways to deliver a lot of different education. That's the drive. Are there problems with that, Dan? Do we have consequences when we do that? Yes, but if we're going to get to fit, because all kids are remarkable, we need to deliver remarkable opportunities to them.
Do we have any questions from the members of the audience here? There's a gentleman right there.
I guess I have a lot of things that I'd like to say, but I guess I'd like to start off with there is no money in schools. You're not out there to make a profit. That's what it's not. It's not about profit. It's about educating people. And it's just like the military. We never argue about building another plane or building another ship or putting more nuclear weapons out there. That's okay. But when it comes to our kids, it is a losing proposition. We are losing money because we have to invest in our future. which we have not done. And Michigan is a terrible example of it, and that is they're paying their employees. They set them. I am a retired teacher, and I had to go back 10 years to get to my highest pay because they made us feel worth less. That's what's wrong with Michigan. They don't care about education. All they care about is profits, and our Secretary of Education certainly proves that. Thank you.
Anyone would like to respond?
Yeah. There's a new dynamic in our country. I think there's a shift for many, especially at higher levels of our policy makers, seeing the purpose of education is different, seeing it as a private good rather than a public good. And I know sometimes even Dan and I can debate a lot about charter schools and privatization and so forth, but I think a lot of it comes down to vision and whether do we see our education system as a public good? Is it serving all of us? Is it necessary, like our highway system, so that we can advance our economy?
That's sort of
and
a
maintain
problem too, right?
Yeah, we're seeing that shift now towards education as a private good. There's going to be winners and losers. And parents that don't make a good choice, hey, it's their fault. It's not the kid's fault, but the kids will pay the price. And, in a cynical view, when we look at our charter school establishment in our state, we're looking now at close to 90% of our schools are operated by private companies. This is not the vision of charter schools, that we're going to be small, locally run schools. We're seeing a lot of our tax dollars now running out of state with these operators of these schools. And in a very cynical view, it's generating winners and losers, and that's going to be good for the for-profit prison industry.
Dan, I feel like I have to give you a chance to respond there.
A couple of things. I want to go back to the comment in the audience. My daughter's a teacher. I understand. In fact, some of us have seen Michigan data surveyed and polled of the adults in our schools, all of them in Michigan. And a term that just shocked me was our adults are demoralized. That is not a good thing. Let me tell you why I think some of that's happened, because back in the 70s, we decided, even though everyone's working hard and we're investing a lot of money, we are not getting the outcomes that we expect. Even if we're doing better than other countries, we're not getting the outcomes we expect from the money we're investing in that. And there's 50 years of frustration being built up. That creates the kind of pressure. So thank you for the service that you provide. Thank you for teachers doing what they do. It's a pressurized, demoralized environment. We got to fix that. That's number one. Yes, I completely object with what Gary is saying about privatizing. He said earlier in some comments, private charter schools. Charter schools are public schools. They're LEAs, just like a local school district. They have the opportunity.
For people who don't know what an LEA is, can you explain
local
that?
Education agency. It's actually an entity. So Kalamazoo Public is an LEA. Every charter school in the state of Michigan is an LEA. What Gary refers to and then runs too far with is the fact that people contract for services. Kalamazoo Public has private contractors that they use for services. Matinga, you're a consultant. You're a private contractor. Gary makes money as a researcher. Everyone's making money. The difference is there accountability in the system? Yes, there is. All of those dollars, you can go on the website, you figure out how they're spent and where they go and what they do. And we're seeing actually some of those private operators, and they're not out of state. Most of them in Michigan are local. 70% of the charter schools in Detroit are run by Detroiters. And they may have private, nonprofit entities managing a school or doing something with a facility. They're private, they're local. But the best 3 top high schools in Michigan are run by a private, for-profit charter school operation. K-8, 4 of the top elementary schools in the state of Michigan are run by a management organization. Do we care if it's accountable and transparent where those investment dollars come from? They're not coming from taxpayers. They're coming from the investment community. Well, Dan, that's got incentives to it or other kinds of things. Yeah, but it's accountability. There are public boards in charge of it, and there are disincentives in other places as well. The point is, we need to be looking in different ways to deliver education in different means to get the remarkable outcomes we're looking for. Doing the same thing we've always done will get us the same results, and they define that as insanity.
You wanted to respond?
I do. Just a couple of things. First of all, I think that when we began to define educational expenses as expenses and not as investments in children, I think we began to go down a bad road. And that's been the last several years in Michigan. That's one. Two, you've got a number of people who have attacked educators pretty hard, particularly in the last 7 years. They've gone after their benefits in an enormous way, gone after pensions, gone after health insurance, and they've made the profession as a whole less desirable. Chickens come home to roost, and the reality is if you look at our schools of education in this state, you can see the tremendous deterioration of numbers in those schools of education. It's not simply Western, it's Eastern, it's Central. It's across the state in schools of education. The number of young people who want to become teachers has diminished. And it's diminished because our policymakers have torn down the profession. And now they're realizing that they've actually created a real problem. And it's going to take years and years and years to address this problem. You're not going to. It takes a long time to build up a profession. It takes a very, very little time on the part of a state to tear it down. And this state's lawmakers, over a period of time, I don't want to paint fully with a single brush or paint with a paint can for that matter. But the reality is that institutionally we've really gone after educators over a period of years at the state level, particularly in the last 7 years, and it has served us poorly, and will continue to serve us poorly as we struggle to find teachers to teach our young people in the ensuing decades.
Do we have another question in the audience? There's a few hands there, Lindsay.
Hi, I live in a rural district and work in an urban district in 2 different counties that are about an hour away. My question is about mobility, and for people who don't know what mobility means in schools, that means children bouncing from building to building or district to district. I'd like to know what Dr. Rice and Mr. Quisenberry have to say, what they're doing to help control the mobility of students, which directly affects the students' education and their growth. We have multiple students who will bounce from building to building or district to district because their parents don't like something that's happening in the school. What are you doing to stop that so our children have a chance to grow, the schools have a chance to show that there's growth, so we can show those metrics? What can we do to help our students gain the education that they need?
Yeah, you're right. Mobility or transience is an enormous challenge, not simply within the region, but across the state, across the country. In Kalamazoo Public Schools, we have a choice system. That choice system includes transportation. In the vast majority of circumstances, we transport approximately 2/3, or about 9,000 of 13,000 students every day. An additional chunk of kids are eligible for that transportation. So you have young people who are literally pinballing around the community because they have unstable housing situations, given their their socioeconomic challenges, given the poverty with which they're living. Notwithstanding that instability, they're able to continue to go to the same school because we don't have neighborhood schools per se. We do have schools of choice, and we think that helps mitigate that mobility. Now, there's still a fair bit of mobility in the district. I'm not suggesting that there isn't, but that's probably our largest effort to mitigate or reduce that adverse effect of mobility.
Dan?
Yeah, it's going to look different in any place in the state. I'm not even sure there's really good data about this. I'm most familiar with the Detroit area, and there's a huge issue with what you're calling mobility in the city of Detroit, and it's largely related to poverty. It's a huge geographic city with pockets of population, other places where there's nobody living, and depending on whether you've been you need to move across town or something, it's going to make it very difficult for you to get to the school that you just enrolled in. That's kind of part of it. Let me speak to something different. That's something that I don't know that we anticipated well with choice. I want to support parents in understanding the word investment was used by Dr. Rice. It's not just about dollars. We ought to think about this like any of us who invest in our pensions do. You put your money in, you leave it there, right? You figure out what school is going to work for your kid. Unless something just really goes wrong, stick with that investment and stay there. Don't keep moving. That's something I think we need to help people understand. Hey, you've got a choice that's remarkable. You can find something that fits for your kid. Don't move every year if you can avoid it. Or in some places we literally are seeing it like, well, okay, the teacher made me mad, I'm gone. And then you see in the first 4-6 weeks of school, people taste testing. I want to try this school, I want to try that school, I want to try that school, and settling in after 2 months. Those are outcomes of things I think we just need to help people be aware. These are the impacts of what you're deciding to do. Here's some things we can support you with is better information, ways to make those choices possible. Transportation is one of them, but I also just think location of schools, things like that are possible. Gary and I were talking before the panel even about online things or maybe some solutions in there because this mobility question is very, very, very different depending on where in the state you're talking about. It'd be a whole different discussion if we were talking about the UP.
We have other questions I want to get to. I just want to turn it to you, Matinga, briefly. What is the impact on a teacher who has a lot of mobility in their district, and you get is that a gear shift when the student's been in one school or been in another system, and you have to spend more time to bring that student up to the speed of where you're at?
Right, and remember that the teacher also gets evaluated in the same exact rubric as the teacher who has no mobility that year whatsoever. And I want to maybe, hopefully, just encourage you to think outside of the box for a minute. You know, I went to boarding schools all my life. I had 3 meals a day. I had stability. I had somebody looking after my homework. And I had, and it was equitable. And some of them were not necessarily private schools. And the idea in the United States, somehow it's become abhorrent somehow to house a child in a boarding school situation. But I feel like sometimes the situation calls for really creative thinking. And if we can provide homes, stable homes for these kids who have to be transient, and rather than them being victims of their biography. And I say this, you think, well, how are we going to fund that? Well, think about how much we're spending for prison, for an inmate who is in boarding school, who is there as a boarder, and thinking about how we can prevent that. And as I'm going to completely botch a quote by Frederick Douglass, it is easier to raise strong children than to mend broken men. And so if we have this issue with mobility and we can't control what the parents are, why don't we come up with a solution that is best for the child rather than for the district, or just kind of go after the parent? And I'd like to address that issue that you came up with when the parents come to school, they don't like something, and they pull their kids out. As professional educators, we have lost our integrity when it comes to being an expert. We've allowed the community to come in and just tell us how to do the work and how to do the job, something you would never do with a doctor, something you would never do with other professions. And so as teachers, I think it's one thing that we can do, and as administrators, it's one thing we can do. It's one thing to listen to the parent, but it's another thing to watch a parent be destructive and not necessarily intervene for the sake of that child. I know there's legal issues, but at one point, we are the professionals, and we have to claim that expertise once again.
Another question from the audience, please.
Hi.
Hi.
Are we on? Dr. Matinga and Dr. Rice. We talked about how achieving top 10 in 10 years, and Dr. Rice had mentioned that first and foremost would be increasing literacy rates. Now, Dr. Matinga also noted that schools are in a position where there's not a whole lot of like freestyle capability in these curriculum, and that there's lack of engagement. And Dr. Rice had also noted that to increase literacy, we'd be focusing on what you had really only touched on with reading literacy. So my question for both of you are, what are your thoughts on increasing the teaching and implementation of multimodal literacy and the arts to increase literacy rates overall, to increase engagement, and to give students a platform to display what makes them kick ass, unquote? Dr. Matinga.
Why don't we start with...
Oh, sure. I'll take that one. Thank you. And I can tell by your question that you are a creative teacher, right? And I think that you're specifically talking about evolving our own profession, right? So now the idea of holding the chalk and standing in the front of the room, that idea needs to die, like yesterday. And in order to replace that, there are so many other different things that teachers can do. But one of the things that I would like to encourage is also to go further. I really believe that educators are the ones that can create these systems and create these ideas. But in order for us to do that, we need to have also a different set of experiences. So in my little world in my mind, teachers, as part of our training and our yearly, or at least every 5 years, we get to travel. We get to experience. We get to go to the private sector. We get to go all these places to get the knowledge and to prepare the kids for the world that's going to be out there. So now, if we do that, and if we become these people that kids can look up and go, wow, that kid, I want to be that person, I can tell you that we're not going to come back in the classroom and grab that chalk and sit in front of the room and not practice multimodal teaching. So once, as teachers, we go out in the real world, and by real world, I mean, like we all live in the real world, you know what I mean? Like we go outside of the bus route, and we engage our communities, we engage experts from other fields, we do all of these things, there is no way you can come back and put it in a box and try to put that in a worksheet. So for that is something that as teachers we can control. We can work to become people that kids look up and feel like, wow, that person kicks ass, and I want to be like them. And that's what's going to make the child become more inspired, and that's also what's going to grow more teachers.
Dr. Rice?
Well, a couple answers. First of all, I believe in multimodal. I believe in multisensory. I think that there's some tremendous advantage to that. I also think that there's some tremendous advantage to children being able to pick up the literature that they want to pick up and to read what they want to pick up. So, for example, rather than requiring children to slog through Beowulf, which is a horrifying text. It was when I was young when it was written, and it's still horrifying 1,000 years later. You know, why not let children read Zora Neale Hurston or Langston Hughes or Margaret Walker or Alice Walker or Nikki Giovanni or James Baldwin or 1,000 other authors that might be more interesting to, more engaging with our young people. We had a literacy conference at Western Michigan University 2 months ago. It was called Mirrors of Me, Children Seeing Themselves in Their Literature, and it was about the importance of children being able to see their diverse images in what they read and being able to make selections associated with their interests. So I think that there's some, beyond the multisensory, multimodal, I think there's some value in the individual selections of reading.
And if I can add real quick, also in the selection of core classes, we have American literature, British literature. And what about the Bhagavad Gita? What about the Tales of Genji? What about, I'm saying, like, we don't have the wide range of...
What about West African literature?
Right, exactly. And so the idea that we have these courses...
We can start with Things Fall Apart and go to No Longer at Ease, and we go straight through Chinua Achebe and move on.
There you have it. And so I think we can encourage also multi-sensorial experiences by creating courses or by creating core courses that are also what he is explaining, core courses, not just the electives somehow, because the electives is what makes the core, not the other way around.
Things Fall Apart is a fantastic book, by the way. I'd like to get in another audience member question here.
Hi. Oh, thank you. Dr. Rice, first of all, I really, really do appreciate your passion for literature and promoting literacy for our kids. It's a noble cause. However, time and time again, you have offered literacy as a solution to the struggles that KPS is having. Over and over again, I hear that we need more literacy programs. At the same time, you recognize that many of the problems we face in KPS are due to a lack of resources. They are due to a lack of community involvement, poverty, instability. And I wonder what you are doing to address those needs in the meantime. You have mentioned a need for more counselors. However, we have fewer school psychologists working right now than we are budgeted for in Kalamazoo. Mm-hmm. We have teachers who have asked for trauma-informed training and have not received that. That's something that would greatly benefit kids that are suffering from the effects of poverty. You've mentioned with community involvement. Unfortunately, our school doors are not open to many in Kalamazoo, including parents, because of stringent background checks and requirements. I just wonder what you're doing to address those things.
Sure. Well, that's a big question, and I'm not convinced we're going to be able to shoehorn the answer into the next 16 minutes, nor do I want to filibuster necessarily for that time. But I will take a crack at two pieces of that question. I'd be happy to talk with you afterwards if you'd like. With respect to resources, a number of us, including Middle Cities Education Association, our executive director, Ray Tellman, was here earlier, are working to lobby the state for more money. 2 years ago or 3 years ago, we got $70 million more in at-risk funding across the state. This past school year, $120 million in at-risk funding across the state. It's $190 million more on a base that was $309 million 3 years ago. Now, it's an extraordinary percentage increase. It's not the dollar amount that we need, but it's certainly a start to where we need to go in the state. That's one. Two, there was a study that was recently done on school funding in the state. It came out in the summer of 2016. It was largely deep-sixed by the administration and by legislators. A group of us called the School Funding Research Collaborative have gotten together, and we're working to drive a new study of school funding in the state, a broader study of school funding in the state, which essentially makes the case to the legislature for more funding. The first study showed that we were underfunded by $1,000 per kid in base funding, number one. 40% additionally needs to be given to English language learners. 30% more should be generated per poor child. So that making that case in an adequacy study for school funding is a prerequisite for driving it in a state legislature. If you don't have the studies, you can't get it done. So that's on the resource side. $190 million more in at-risk funding in the last 3 years, number one. The first study, number two. The School Funding Research Collaborative, I urge you to take a look at that. The funding source is in that tri-county area, but it's an important piece, and it's going to be completed by January of 2018. There are no... just to correct the record, there are no bars short of people having listed offenses, legally listed offenses. There are no bars to coming into Kalamazoo Public Schools.
Gary, you wanted to add to that.
I thought maybe we could take it globally now because Michael has described a situation here in Kalamazoo. But when we look at poverty as a driver, and it's really important to look again at the international assessment data as a dipstick to look at how the United States does. We don't perform very well in these international comparisons on educational achievement and based on cognitive learning. But when we break out our data and we look at the children who are not in poverty, we have a high-performing education system in our country. We're doing really well. It's our children in poverty. When we look at these other high-performing countries, like Finland, like even Hungary, like some of the Asian countries, and we look at their high-poverty students, they are struggling with those students too. The big difference, though, between our country and these other OECD industrialized countries is that we have such a much larger portion of our population is in poverty. And the cost, I mean, it's very hard to remediate some of the issues in our communities with just money. I think Kalamazoo's very typical of many of the urban cities in our country, across the state and in our country, and they're not so different from other countries except for the scale. And our education system is very much weighted down by the crisis we have, but it's not a crisis in our education system, it's a crisis in educating children in poverty.
Lindsay, I think we had a couple questions in the middle and the back there.
Can I go here?
Oh, sure.
Thank you. Hi, I'm a teacher up at Godwin Heights High School, and the gentleman next to Dr. Rice, is your name Dan? Okay, I noticed that you had the comment of stop moving, and I just wondered how much you know about the students that are moving, because it's not their choice, and sometimes they have to move from those districts. So I just kind of wondered where you got that. But my real question was, what is the state doing about students not going to college? Because as a teacher, SAT, I want to get my students to college. Not all students need to go to college. So what is the state of Michigan doing to help those students that aren't going to college?
You want to take the first part or all of that, Dan?
I'd like to go back and think about what I might have portrayed to say parents in poverty that are forced to move. We should tell them to stop. I didn't intend that if that's the way it came across. There are parents, though, that have the ability to choose, or I'm encouraging them. We need to educate parents on making an investment in a school and staying where we can. Other places, we're going to have to think of other solutions where it's economic issues. And those aren't easy. Again, it depends on what part of the state you're talking about, whether it's St. Helens, Michigan, or the Upper Peninsula or downtown Detroit. So those are things we need to, I think, be really creative about. We won't solve it, in my opinion, with a yellow bus system. We got to think of some different ways to do that. It's remarkable that any of us could pull out our phone and we could have Uber and this and that and 3 or 4 different ways to take us someplace. Why can't we figure out something for schools and parents and kids? I don't know. We can do it. We ought to try and not be afraid of a private investment. Just make sure it's transparent. We got to figure those things out. On the higher ed thing, I would just say that was driven by No Child Left Behind. That's a national thing, not a state thing. There are a number of charter schools early on before No Child Left Behind that were what I would call vocational schools. Again, back to my point about choice being important. There was an automotive school over by the airport in Detroit. It was what it sounded like. It was what we called auto shop, class when I went to high school. But it was a complete school geared around getting kids to technical certification and prepared for auto mechanics and things like that. It was a widely popular school. Got driven out of existence by college expectations, quality teacher expectations, all of which are good things, but wasn't thinking about voc ed and kids that are looking at a different path. I think you're hearing something. My quick comment, I'd be interested in hearing what others are saying about it. I'm attending a meeting the governor's going to have next week to reprioritize different pathways for kids and making it doable and possible and aligned with what we're going to try to do as a state. I don't know if that addresses your question, but I think it's coming back around. The pendulum went one way, it's coming back.
Dr. Rice, just briefly, I'd love to hear your perspective on that, about students that maybe aren't interested in college or aren't heading there. What do you see the education system doing for them to still propel them forward?
Sure. Well, we have an early middle college program where kids can study at the high school, at the college, and get a career certificate or certificate of achievement, an associate's degree. There are a whole lot of ways to have careers without getting a 4-year diploma. And our board 9 months ago, approved 36 programs that kids can enter while in high school and jointly enroll at Kalamazoo Valley Community College. 36 programs where they can work on a career credential shy of a 4-year degree, come out from high school with this career credential, go right into the world of work. There's real power to that. We've got 19 kids who are part of it this year. I anticipate that more will be a part of it next year and in coming years as well.
Another question back there, Lindsay?
Hi. I've heard you say that it's important that we use evidence to do what works and also encourage the art of teaching that educators know so well. I've heard you mention a couple times that the nations who are successful educationally have common standards. I'm wondering if you could comment on what is happening with Common Core standards in this country, how it has become so politicized, and why now our Michigan Department of Education will not even discuss Common Core standards.
I'd like to start with Dr. Miron.
Common Core standards have become rather politicized, and I think a lot of the politics that cloud surrounding them is shifting. And I think, from my sense, is that they're still driving state curriculum in the majority of states. There's still the core that's driving many of the key assessments as well. I think now that they're becoming less of a political football, it's going to be easier for politicians on both sides of the aisle to look at the value of those standards and come together once again, because we really do need national standards, especially in science, math, and reading, these core subjects.
Do we have another question?
Thank you. This isn't really a question, but it's a concern that I have, and I'm concerned about the students who come from parents who don't parent them, the students who live in households where the parents don't value education, where they don't make sure they eat good food and that they do their homework. And I feel that these are kids that their population is growing and that they are the ones who are affecting some of these scores that we're talking about. I'm not really concerned about children who come from families that their parents care about their education and they care about them and they want them to do well. Those are the people that are here and that are trying to do something about it. But what do we do about the social problem that we have of children who are not being parented and you know, they're not being successful in school or even successful as citizens once they get out of school?
I just want to, and was the audience able to hear that question? I want to make sure because of the train. Okay, I'm seeing some heads nodding. I'd like to start with you on that, Matinga.
Yeah, and you know, it's such a good question because I believe, especially in public education, that is where that child should find that place where they can learn what the talent is. They can learn how to problem solve. They can learn how to even problem solve the problems they're having at home. Not necessarily like somebody's going to come and help you, but how to mitigate some of those problems. I believe that our fixation with these test scores and these standards are keeping adults from taking care of some of these children. If teachers were allowed to freestyle, if teachers were allowed to customize their learning to their student and not necessarily be so caught up in these measurements, these kids would be taken care of a lot better. I think they're the fallout. The fact that a child can come to school and go back home without come to an academic institution without learning how to deal with the things that are in the streets is not just a travesty, but it's malpractice in our part.
Matinga, I want to follow up on something you said earlier that got a fair amount of applause from the audience, who's saying that, you know, when Dr. Rice said, well, we need shorter summer breaks because of that downtime, and then you were mentioning that some kids need that life experience. But I think the families that maybe the person who just asked the question are asking about are often the families that can't provide those out-of-school experiences that are so educational. How do you find that balance for those kids that can't go on a trip or can't get to the museums in the summer?
It's school. I mean, if you're going to do year-round school programs, do them for things like that, for enrichment, and not necessarily for as cram school. Just enrichment programs year-round. That I'm up for. Not necessarily always academic. Always academic.
Doug, I'd chime in a little bit too to say I think it's a broad brush. I don't want to make a judgment here, but all kids are remarkable. I've met kids. There's a couple of charter schools in Detroit that were set up because they were being boarded. They were homeless. and they needed an education. So it made the most sense. Detroit Public Schools could not respond to that need. They set up a charter school to really address the needs. First and foremost of those kids that were homeless. Those kids were remarkable. If you hadn't told me who they were, I wouldn't have known who they were. I would have thought they were just a regular suburban kid. So let's start with all kids are remarkable, and they do remarkable things no matter their circumstances. Second, I think I would agree. I think I've heard Dr. Rice say a couple times tonight, we need to look at our funding in Michigan and make sure we're weighting poverty as a priority, so that school districts that wherever those school districts are, they're teaching kids in poverty, they're getting a little bit extra, just like we do with special education or anything else. That would help. And then the other thing is more of a governance issue. We as adults in Michigan put money in buckets. There's K-12 education money, there's higher ed money, there's social services money, there's this money, there's that money. And the walls between those adults don't come down. It's ridiculous. So you ought to be able to bring those services to bear where kids need them, where families need them. It makes the most sense at a school, and not to say schools ought to be the solution for everything, but you're right. Some kids need schools to be that, and I think we could do it if we figured it out and got past the adult politics. There was another point I was thinking about as you talked, but I just wanted to throw it was this. And I don't know this research well enough to debate it, but I've seen research that says the opposite. High-income kids aren't being educated as well in our schools. They learn because of their family situations, less about what they're learning at school. And we actually do a pretty decent job value-adding to kids in poverty. So I think we just want to make sure we're looking hard, that we're really doing everything we expect in the United States of America. All kids with an excellent education so they can all become successful in their lives. And that's got to be the goal, as hard as it is for us to deal with.
We've got time for one last question, and the gentleman in the back with the red shirt's been waiting patiently.
Okay. This kind of goes to things that you guys have all been talking about. We talk about we want to make decisions driven by evidence, based on studies. They're already out there. Dr. Miron mentioned one about when we break out the international data by poverty level, we don't have an education problem, we have a poverty problem. You can talk about a lot of the other things you talked about. It all comes down to a lot of this stuff is already out there. So why do you think no decisions are actually being made based on the data that already exists?
Dr. Miron?
Some years back, I was in Finland, and Finland is seen as this miracle country. And they talked about a 30-year school reform is what they've been going under, and they do it systematically. They do it consensus-based. They don't implement reforms that can't survive elections. And what they said at the time is that they said, we pilot test all our ideas before we implement them. We study these ideas. We look at the research, and they said, and there's some Americans here. We use your research. It's wonderful. Why doesn't your government choose your research? And it's right. We have a lot of evidence, and our policy formation process in our country is rather different than what we see in other countries. And I think we have to understand that context because I think there's a lot of good evidence on how we can improve schools. There's a lot of good evidence on how we can address issues of poverty. They require investment, but the evidence also shows that what kind of return we're going to get on those investments. But our policy formation process is where we have to look.
May I?
Yes, please.
We have somehow managed to promise children that if they get an education, that's they're guaranteed a successful life. That's a big promise to make them. Yet we are not using our resources and our research to create that road. And what worries me is that by not, for example, there was a study just that I heard on NPR, a study about how teens need to be sleeping at 8 o'clock in the morning. Did you hear that one? And how kids need to be sleeping in the morning because they're almost like cats. They stay up late and they have to sleep in. And then when they talk to the education experts as to why that study was not being addressed, they said, well, the bus schedule is such. And so we have these systemic, dogmatic thinking that, once again, is making us break that promise. Education, especially higher ed, is now losing its integrity. Kids are not buying the idea that paying $120,000 for college is what's going to get you the job, because the job is not there. Kids are not buying the idea when they can go to Google and look, the physics teacher is telling them to read the book when they're taking quantum physics online. And they have by a professor that's so much better than their physics teacher or their calculus teacher or whatever. We need to look in the mirror and ask ourselves, what are we playing at? What exactly are we playing at? Because just like as a neurologist, I can scramble your brain as a teacher and really, really change the course of your life. That's a great, great point you make.
I don't know what you did to the train company, but it's like the third time.
Doug, I'd like to add one more piece in here to this point. The research has been discussed, et cetera. Something that's obvious, but we need to acknowledge it. Public policy in any place, but certainly in Michigan, is not an engineering function. It's a political function. We argue about things, and they're put together. The last comes first, and then middle pieces are added. Some pieces are never added, right? That's what I mean by that. Something I think we need to consider in Michigan is that other states actually do better. We have a state board of education. Can anyone name some of them? They hire the state superintendent, and yet he's treated as a cabinet person to the governor who's elected, and we all know who the governor is. We've got a governance problem. I'm not sure what the best solution is, but that doesn't work because the people who are driving education policy, the legislature, the governor, the state board, the superintendent, are all different people. There's no way to get a solid strategy, even right, wrong, or indifferent. I choose A. Let's go after plan A to have that done consistently, coherently in Michigan. It's a mess. And we got to be willing to tackle that. It's going to be provocative, and we're going to argue about it because it's politics.
I'd like to close. We began with Dr. Michael Rice, the superintendent of the Kalamazoo schools. I'd like to close, and we've heard about a lot of problems. What could we end on a positive note? What motivates you every day? And when we drove into town, on the signs are the Kalamazoo Promise. Since 2005, home of the Kalamazoo Promise. There's obviously a lot of pride here about education. What makes you optimistic?
What makes me optimistic is watching our young people interact with one another on a regular basis and help one another and encourage one another, notwithstanding some of the challenges that they have in their lives. That's what makes me optimistic, and that's what gets me up every day, knowing that I've got something to work with and something to work for. Our young people are terrific, notwithstanding their challenges in their lives.
On that note, thank you all for coming very much. Please give a nice round of applause for our panel. And we also want to thank you all for coming and staying, including the folks with a blanket across their legs here. It got a little chilly, but we appreciate all the thoughtful comments, and thank you for attending the event. Thanks very much.